Portlandia, Season 8, Episode 6. Portlandia, Season 8, Episode 6. Open Mic, an expanded narrative summary. Chapter 1. The drizzle and the call to expression. The cool, unrelenting Oregon mist hung like a velvet curtain over the towering Douglas firs and brick storefronts of Portland, casting a soft, metallic sheen across the pavement. Inside a sunlit, wood-paneled coffee house on Hawthorne Boulevard, where the air was heavy with the rich aroma of single-origin espresso and toasted hazelnut milk, Fred and Carrie sat at their usual corner table. They were deep in a quiet, contemplative discussion about the state of local culture when a brightly colored flyer on the community bulletin board caught Fred's eye. It was a hand-drawn advertisement, complete with intricate doodle margins and calligraphic lettering, announcing an upcoming community open mic night at a nearby basement venue. To Fred and Carrie, this wasn't merely a midweek entertainment option, it was a profound civic summons. In a city built upon the sacred pillars of radical inclusion, hyperlocal artistry, and unbridled individuality, attending an open mic was an act of high citizenship. It was a chance to witness raw, unedited human souls laid bare without the corrupting filter of commercial record labels or corporate talent agents. "We have to go, Carrie," Fred insisted, his eyes wide with earnest devotion as he gestured toward the flyer with his spoon. "This is where the real work happens. This is the unpolished gemstone of Portland's artistic heart." Carrie nodded solemnly, taking a delicate sip of her oat milk latte. "If we don't support the raw, emerging voices of our neighborhood, Fred, then we're just passive consumers of culture. We owe it to the community to sit in that audience and hold space for whatever comes off that stage." With a shared sense of moral duty and aesthetic optimism, the duo pledged to spend their Thursday evening at the venue, entirely unprepared for the sheer endurance test that awaited them in the damp subterranean depths of the city's performance underground. Chapter 2. Descending into the Crucible. When night fell over the city, Fred and Carrie made their way down a narrow, creaky flight of wooden stairs into the basement of the Velvet Fern, a multi-hyphenate space that operated as a vintage bicycle repair shop by day and an avant-garde performance lounge by night. The room was small, humid, and dimly lit by a combination of mismatched desk lamps and string lights draped over exposed water pipes. A faint scent of damp wool, essential oils, and stale dark roast coffee permeated the air. Taking their seats on a pair of mismatched, hard wooden folding chairs near the middle of the room, Fred and Carrie sat with posture so rigid it bordered on military discipline, determined to project total warmth, openness, and non-judgmental encouragement toward whoever stepped up to the single, squeaking microphone stand at center stage. The host for the evening, a young man wearing an oversized hand-knitted cardigan, fingerless gloves, and a beanie pushed so far back on his head that it defied gravity, approached the microphone with a heavy, philosophical sigh. After a 5-minute introductory monologue about the emotional sacredness of vulnerability in shared spaces, he called up the first performer. What followed was an absolute gauntlet of unbridled, painfully awkward amateur artistry, the avant-garde sound sculptor. A man in a stained corduroy blazer walked on stage carrying a small card table loaded with obscure vintage electronic equipment, a hollowed-out butternut squash, and an electric toothbrush. For 12 agonizing minutes, without making eye contact with the crowd, he modulated the high-pitched screeching feedback of the toothbrush against the dried squash skin, creating a piercing, teeth-chattering tone that made the water pipes hum. The high-stakes spoken-word poet, a fiercely earnest woman wearing round wire-rimmed glasses, took the stage and, without any background music, began delivering a booming, intensely rhythmic monologue about the geopolitical implications of municipal curbside composting. Her delivery swung wildly between whispery, tragic confessions and sudden, vein-popping screams that caused Fred to visibly flinch in his folding chair. The overprepared acoustic purist, a musician carrying a massive, battered leather guitar case, spent 20 minutes meticulously setting up his gear. He adjusted 3 different microstand angles, complained at length to the soundboard operator about tube amp warmth and spatial acoustics, and tuned a rare 12-string guitar using 4 different electronic tuners. After achieving what he deemed the perfect sonic vibe, he struck 2 simple, dissonant chords, blanked on his own lyrics, muttered an apology about bad creative aura, and walked off the stage. Throughout every grueling minute, Fred and Carrie sat paralyzed by their own rigid adherence to Portland social etiquette. Every instinct inside them begged them to stand up, quietly slip out the back door, and escape into the fresh night air. Yet, the overwhelming fear of being perceived as unsupportive, elitist, or culturally insensitive locked them in their seats. They forced tight, painful smiles, clapping with desperate enthusiasm after every bizarre act, their hands growing sore from dutiful applause. Chapter 3: High-Stakes Ideology at Women and Women First. While Fred and Carrie were battling creative exhaustion in the basement of the Velvet Fern, the cultural wave of the open mic movement had reached the iconic dusty aisles of the Women and Women First bookstore. Inside the legendary feminist establishment, where the smell of old paper was matched only by the dense atmosphere of ideological vigilance, Tony, Carrie Brownstein, and Candace, Fred Armisen, were engaged in their own high-strung, uncompromising debate. Sitting behind the cluttered glass display counter amidst stacks of hand-bound zines, yellowing academic journals, and lavender incense burners, Candace held a local arts gazette between her trembling, rings-adorned fingers. Her face was twisted in an expression of profound disgust. "Tony, look at this," Candace spat, hurling the gazette onto the counter with a loud thud that startled a cat sleeping on a nearby pile of books. Another unregulated, open-access performance night in the Arts District. It is an outrage. Tony adjusted her thin wire-rimmed glasses, leaning over the counter with sharp, falcon-like intensity. "Explain the nuance to me, Candace. Why is the open mic triggering such deep structural concern in your spirit tonight?" "Because, Tony," Candace declared, her voice rising into a dramatic, theatrical tremolo as she gestured wildly with her hands. "An open mic is nothing more than an unvetted, self-indulgent platform for unchecked acoustic posturing. It creates an undisciplined vacuum where airtime is handed out without any peer review, radical accountability, or intersectional auditing. Anyone with a 3-chord ukulele song can walk up to that pedestal and occupy public emotional space." Tony nodded rapidly in fierce agreement, her jaw set in a hard line. "You are so right, Candace. The open stage is an unchecked playground of male entitlement and unchecked vocal airtime. We cannot allow raw, uncurated expression to float around the city without proper theoretical framing." Driven by their intense commitment to cultural oversight, Tony and Candace immediately pulled out a pair of heavy, cloth-bound ledgers and began drafting a radical 20-page manifesto. Their plan was to form a local volunteer committee that would force every open mic performer in the Tri-County area to submit a fully annotated, peer-reviewed thesis explaining the historical privilege behind their acoustic ballads before being allowed anywhere near an amplifier. Chapter 4: The Great Epiphany of the Audience. Back in the sweltering basement of the Velvet Fern, the evening had dragged past midnight, and the air had grown thick with ambient heat, static noise, and endless performance anxiety. Fred's lower back was throbbing from the wooden folding chair, and Carrie's smile had frozen into a rigid, porcelain mask of exhaustion. During a prolonged intermission where a performer was setting up a complex rig of rhythmic rainsticks, Fred leaned over to Carrie, his voice dropping to a panicked whisper. "Carrie," Fred murmured, his eyes darting nervously toward the exit sign. "I don't know how much more spoken-word poetry about urban farming I can process. My brain is starting to turn into stone." "We can't leave, Fred," Carrie whispered back fiercely, grabbing his forearm. "If we walk out now, the singer-songwriter sitting behind us will know we didn't stay for a set. We'll be labeled as community disruptors." Desperate for a distraction, Fred slowly turned his head to scan the room, looking at the faces of the 40-some people packed into the basement. It was in that quiet moment of observation that a sudden, shocking realization washed over him like a bucket of icy river water. He nudged Carrie frantically. "Carrie, look at the audience. Look at what everyone is holding." Carrie blinked, turning her gaze toward the crowd. For the first time all evening, she looked beyond her own anxiety and truly observed her fellow attendees. Sitting in the row behind them was a young man nervously tapping his fingers against a wooden tambourine. To their left, a woman was frantically revising lines in a leather journal with a red pen. To their right, a man was silently practicing chord shapes on the neck of a silent ukulele. Every single person sitting on the hard folding chairs was holding an instrument, a notebook, a tuning fork, or a set of stage props. There were no casual music lovers in the room. There were no local art enthusiasts or curious neighbors who had paid to watch a show. The room was populated exclusively by other performers waiting for their own assigned slot on the sign-up sheet. "Nobody is listening," Carrie whispered, her mouth dropping open in utter disbelief. "Fred, nobody is listening to the person on stage." The truth revealed itself in all its hilarious, absurd glory. The sound sculptor, the composting poet, the 12-string purist, none of them were performing for an audience. They were performing for a room full of people who were entirely consumed by their own internal dress rehearsals, desperately waiting for their own fleeting 5 minutes of absolute validation. The audience was an illusion. The room was merely a waiting room for the microphone. Chapter 5: Freedom in the Rain. The weight of their self-imposed social obligation instantly evaporated. Exchanging a brief, wordless look of pure understanding, Fred and Carrie slowly stood up from their folding chairs. Because every single person in the room was staring down at their own notes or tuning their own gear. Not a single head turned as Fred and Carrie slipped quietly down the center aisle, pushed open the heavy wooden door, and walked up the creaky stairs. Stepping out of the alleyway, they emerged onto the quiet, rain-slicked pavement of the street above. The cool midnight air hit their faces like a soothing balm, washing away the humid haze of the basement. The rain had softened into a gentle, misting drizzle, reflecting the amber glow of the streetlights along the wet asphalt. They walked side by side down the empty sidewalk, listening to the quiet, rhythmic sound of their own footsteps against the pavement, a sound delightfully devoid of acoustic guitars, rainsticks, or frantic poetry. "You know, Carrie," Fred said softly, pulling his waterproof jacket hood over his head as they reached the corner. "I think true artistic expression isn't about getting up on a stage and forcing everyone to look at you." "No," Carrie agreed with a serene, weary smile, taking a deep breath of the fresh, pine-scented night air. "Sometimes, the most artistic thing you can do for your community is just to go home, turn off the amplifier, and let the night be quiet." They turned the corner together, disappearing into the soft, glowing amber light of the Portland drizzle, leaving the endless parade of amateur manifestos and acoustic ballads far behind them in a sharp, affectionate celebration of the fine line between creative passion and absolute social satire. Open Mic, a narrative episode summary. Chapter 1. The Quest for an Audience. The damp, overcast skies of Portland provided the familiar backdrop as the city's eclectic residents pursued their latest passions. At the local coffee shop, Fred and Carrie find themselves intrigued by the concept of an open mic night. Drawn to the promise of raw, unfiltered artistic expression, they decide to venture out and experience the local underground scene, setting off a chain reaction of awkward social interactions and niche creative endeavors across the city. Chapter 2. Main narrative threads and sketches. The Open Mic Experiment. Fred and Carrie attend a community open mic night intending to be supportive audience members. However, they quickly become overwhelmed by the painfully uncomfortable performances, bizarre poetry readings, and endless amateur acoustic songs. Caught between their desire to be polite, progressive Portlanders and their sheer agony over the terrible performances, they struggle to find a polite way to escape without offending the local community. Tony and Candace's feminist perspective at Women and Women First, the legendary feminist bookstore. Tony, Carrie Brownstein, and Candace, Fred Armisen, confront modern performance culture. They express deep skepticism toward the concept of open mics, viewing them as self-indulgent platforms that lack patriarchal accountability, leading to a hilarious, high-strung critique of amateur comedy and spoken word. The overprepared performer. A local musician spends an absurd amount of time preparing for a tiny 3-minute open mic slot, obsessing over obscure vintage gear, sound checks, and artistic vibe, while completely neglecting to practice an actual song. Chapter 3. Climax and Resolution. As the open mic night drags late into the evening, the atmosphere grows increasingly surreal. Fred and Carrie find themselves trapped in a spiraling loop of bizarre stage acts, realizing that the audience consists entirely of other performers waiting for their turn to speak. In a classic Portlandia twist of social satire, they realize that nobody is actually listening to anyone else. Everyone is simply waiting for their own moment in the spotlight. The episode closes with a quiet, humorous reflection on the fine line between artistic expression and total social absurdity in America's favorite hipster enclave.